Hey, Joe.
Good morning.
Good
Hey,
morning. So I think that we are online. Bonjour à tous. Donc, nous avons le grand plaisir en fait
Good
d'avoir
afternoon, everyone. We have the pleasure of having both authors of the book with us. So the book is called Rebellion, Rascals, and Revenue, Tax Follies and Wisdom Through the Ages. Michael Keane and Joel Slamrod. Well, we're very happy to have Michael Keane and Joel Slamrod with us. Michael Keane is a former deputy. He is deputy director at the IMF, and previously head of the tax policy and tax coordination division. He was a professor at the Essex University. He published hundreds of articles on fiscal federalism, on VAT, border carbon tax, and articles with Joel Slamrod, flat tax in Russia as well. That was a very interesting paper. Mick is going to present the book, and Joel Slamrod, who just joined us, and we're very happy to have him. He's a professor at the University of Michigan. He's worked a lot on taxation and public finance matters. I loved his book on tax systems, published at the MIT Press. And now we're going to have the honor and privilege of having both authors of this great book going over 1,000 years of tax history, follies and wisdom. And now I will give you the floor, Mick.
Merci, Greg. Tu es très gentil comme d'habitude.
Thank you, Greg.
Je suis très content d'avoir cette opportunité
and I am very happy to have this opportunity
de cet livre avec Joe.
Talk about this book with Joel.
Oui, c'est un grand honneur pour nous.
It's a great honor for us.
Et,
thank you to Ferdy, and thank you to all of you.
Et maintenant, je vais parler en anglais.
Let me switch to English.
Ça sera mieux, je crois.
It will be better, hopefully.
Okay. Et donc, so let me try to.
Juste un point, donc nous allons avoir une version.
Just a short word. So we'll have an original version with French and English. If you want to follow in French only, please use the interpretation mode on Zoom. We have interpreters who will translate into French. And for those of you who wish to follow in English, there's an English channel. So on the floor, we'll speak French and English. And for our participants, they can follow the language that they want. You have the floor, Mick.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks very much again, Greg. So here is the cover of the book, which we're very proud of. We claim no credit for it, but we think the book has at least a very good cover. So this expression about don't judge a book by its cover, but we're quite happy for you to judge this book by its cover. So yeah, let me take 15 minutes or so just to give a flavor of what the book is about, what it's like. So what we try to do in the book really goes back, I should say, a long way. Joel and I have for many years been exchanging odd stories about tax. And eventually my partner Geraldine says, well, why don't you guys get serious and write a book about all these stories? So we thought about it and decided, yeah, there was a nice book to be written. It's not really intended to be like a summary or a collection simply of strange stories about tax, but rather we try to use these stories about tax to teach them in a kind of gentle way to not only to entertain people, but to convey some basic tax principles in a kind of pleasurable way, the way that might appeal to non-tax people. Because part of our motivation, I think, is really that our profession, meaning kind of public finance economists like me and Joel, probably haven't done a great job over the years in explaining to non-economists how we think about taxation, some of the basic ideas that we use to analyze taxes. So we're trying to in that sense, make thinking about taxes both more interesting and more useful for people who are not brought up like the rest of us, every day, every hour to think about tax. So we try to be entertaining, and you'll see one of the favorite quotes we had about the book was this idea that it's taxation's summer blockbuster, which is a pretty low bar. There aren't many blockbusters about taxation any summer, but nonetheless, we're proud of that one too. So what I'll do then is go through some of give a flavor of what we do in the book. And it's really kind of structured in a way like a public finance textbook, in the sense that we start by talking about some general ideas about taxation, then we talk about fairness, then we talk about efficiency, in a way, optimal taxation. We talk about tax administration, and at the end, we sort of think where tax systems might go. So although it's not explicitly said, you can see there is a kind of a public economics textbook structure to a lot of what we say. So we start then by telling a number of stories just to indicate the importance of tax, really over the millennia. As I'm sure many of you know, some of the first written records that we have from Sumer and other places are tax documents. The Rosetta Stone, which I think I'm British, I think we stole from the French after the French had stolen it from the Egyptians, which was the way that hieroglyphs were translated. That was essentially a tax document about tax exemptions. So it goes back a long way, the influence of tax. And here are just a couple of the stories we tell to kind of highlight the role of taxation. The one on the left is the only war that we know of that was plausibly really just triggered by a tax event. And this is what's called the 10 Cents War of, I think, 1879 to 1884, which was between Bolivia and Peru on one hand and Chile on the other. And basically the story there is that in the middle of the 19th century, there was territory that was claimed by Bolivia that was basically desert. So nobody really cared much who owned it. But then nitrates and guano were discovered there. And then the land became very valuable. A lot of Chilean companies moved in to extract the resource. And Bolivia imposed an export tax on the nitrates that were extracted. But it added a promise that it would not change the tax rate for, I can't remember, 10, 15 years, whatever it was. So it was what we now call a fiscal stability clause, which we still find in natural resource contracts now and again. And you can imagine what happened. Bolivia basically violated its word. It raised the export tax. That prompted Chile to invade Bolivia. Peru then got involved because Peru had a secret treaty with Bolivia. And as you can see from the picture, this was a real war. This was a really violent struggle. And it ended with Bolivia and Peru losing. So the province with the nitrates went to Chile, became pretty important to Chile's subsequent wealth. And it meant also that Bolivia lost its access to the sea. So tax in this case actually explains the map of the world. It explains why Bolivia is landlocked. And this is a dispute that carried on, really still carries on. Even in 2018, there was a case at the International Court of Justice with Bolivia disputing this lost territory. And we're even told that when it comes to the Miss Bolivia contest, apparently they still have such a thing, there is still a representative for the missing province of Atacama. So that's one way in which tax still shapes our world in a very literal sense. The second story on the right, many of you may know this story, but it was a new one to us. What we show here is the wife of Henri Caillaux, who was Minister of Finance, as you know, before the First World War, a great proponent of the income tax. He was also a proponent of better relations with Germany. But essentially what happened was his wife, as you can see in the picture, one day after breakfast, got in a car, went to the offices of Le Figaro, asked for the editor. He was out at the time, so she waited calmly. The editor arrived and she then shot him dead. So why was that? Well, that was because Le Figaro was launching a campaign against Caillaux. And as part of that, they were planning to publish a series of letters that Joseph Caillaux had written to his wife. The trouble was that when he wrote those letters, he was married to somebody else. So this would have been a great scandal, and that prompted Henriette Caillaux to go and murder the editor of Le Figaro. this became, again, as many of you will know, a very celebrated case. And if you look at the newspapers, the French newspapers in July 1914, it was really only the advent of the First World War that knocked this case off the headlines. As you can imagine, she was acquitted, famously acquitted, on the grounds that it was a crime of passion. So what is the tax lesson from this story? Well, there's no tax lesson at all, as far as we can tell. It's just a kind of a great, it's just a kind of a great story. So gives you a little bit of the flavor of the book. We talk, as I say, we talk a fair bit about ideas of fairness in taxation, which are clearly critical to really everything about taxation for the many millennia. Indeed, I should have said at the outset that one of the themes of the book is that really what governments have been trying to do when they tax hasn't changed that much since Sumer or the Rosetta Stone or whenever. They've really been trying to extract resources to raise revenue in ways that give them the money they want, don't actually destroy the tax base, that don't undermine the economic activity that generates revenue, and that are at least fair enough that the government, the rulers, the king, the prince, whoever, at least fair enough that the ruler will survive, politically or even sometimes literally. And so the picture on the left is illustrates the case in which fairness doesn't really, fairness is not in an acceptable way achieved. This is Baibura, who is a national hero still, we believe, in Sierra Leone. And he led what was then called at least a revolt against the British. The British had introduced a hut tax in Sierra Leone. As you know, those were fairly common in colonial times. And this prompted a pretty violent revolt against the British, led by this gentleman, Baibura. Of course, in the end, the British put down the rebellion. Ironically, along the way, although they were trying to tax huts, they actually burnt a lot of villages, therefore destroying exactly the tax base. And so it kind of illustrates the long theme that what goes wrong when taxes are not perceived as fair. But it also illustrates, I think, another lesson we learn from tax revolts, which is that usually there's something else going on. It's not just the tax itself that prompts the revolt. So in this case, for example, it wasn't just the tax, but the way that the tax actually interfered with the rights of tribal chiefs and sense of ownership in the local communities. And the way in which the tax was enforced had various features that were particularly offensive. So tax can trigger revolts. It's not always the only source of revolt. It's usually a trigger when there are many other things going on. The story on the right, and I'll tell this, though it's one of Joel's favorite stories, illustrates how also things can go wrong, even when when a government is well-intentioned. So this is the Queen Emma Bridge in Curacao, which was built in the early 20th century. And they wanted to charge a toll for crossing the bridge, but they wanted to be fair. They wanted to be progressive. So essentially what they did, rather than ask people what their income was, they said, well, if you cross the bridge wearing shoes, you have to pay the toll. If you cross the bridge without shoes, you're obviously poor and you don't have to pay the toll. That sounds kind of very well-intentioned, but you can imagine what happened. Essentially what happened was all the poor people were too ashamed to be seen crossing the bridge shoeless, so they would borrow their friends' shoes to cross the bridge and pay the toll. And the rich people, as rich people will, you know what's coming now, the rich people would take off their shoes when they were crossing the bridge. So it's a kind of metaphor for how, even when you're well-intentioned in tax design, you can have these unintended consequences. And we can see analogs of that, for example, in trying to be fair through designing progressivity of tax systems. As I say, we want to convey also the idea of efficiency, which is a familiar idea to economists. And, as economists, we sit down and we look at the picture on the left and we explain, look, there's a downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve. Look, magically, here's this triangle that's just kind of complete waste. And we say, okay, that's efficiency. Here's the efficiency loss is that triangle, this excess burden. The trouble with that, of course, as an explanation is it's very, very boring. Now, if you try to explain to your friends at a party what excess burden is, and you pull out a napkin and start to draw this picture, they're pretty soon going to go and talk to somebody else. But on the other hand, the picture on the right, we think makes the point very clear. And this, as you know, we all know that France and Britain, we had this window tax for many years in the 18th century. And we know that the consequence of the window tax was, in some sense, it was made sense. How many windows you had should be correlated with how well off you are. But we know the answer was, the response in part was to brick up windows. And this is very physical. So this picture is a very physical manifestation of excess burden in these windows that are blocked up. And we have some other kind of pictorial examples in the book. But I think what's powerful about this is we know what that house should look like. We know there should be windows. But we know also we can see that they're not there. So that's a way of conveying this very difficult feature of excess burden for when we try to explain it to people, that excess burden is about things that are not there. It's about work that isn't undertaken, investments that don't happen. That's a hard idea to convey. But when we talk, for example, about windows, that makes the point very clear. Just as an aside, again, coming back to this general theme of the book that I mentioned about the objectives of taxation not really changing. What changes is the technology. Nowadays we tend to think of the window tax as well. It was very quaint and very strange what our ancestors did. But the UK history, I'm not so sure about the French one, suggests it was really quite clever, because in the UK, or in England rather, what we had before the window tax was a tax on fireplaces. And the trouble with the tax on fireplaces is that somebody had to come into your house and count how many fireplaces you had. And people really didn't like that. That invasion of privacy was, for example, behind one of the features behind a revolution we had in 1688. But what's clever about window tax is, wow, you can count windows without going inside the property. Okay, it's going to have these side effects, but it's actually pretty clever response to this constraint. And as a way also showing how governments have to use the available technology as best they can to enforce taxes. We talk, as you can imagine, quite a lot about evasion and avoidance. Just to give a couple of stories here, the picture on the left is one illustration of, again, something that curiously runs through history, is the weird effects of taxes on ships, on shipping. We still have problems taxing ships, and those actually turn out to go back centuries. So the ship of fools is actually a different ship. It turns out that in the 19th century, when the British Navy was ruling the world, the British merchant fleet, the actual ships that carried cargo, were notoriously unsafe and unseaworthy. And that was because we had a tax that essentially led to very long, thin ships. And although neither Joel or I are experts on shipping technology, that turns out to be a recipe for a pretty unstable ship. The one on the right, on the picture, this was a Dutch ship from Holland called the Vloot, I think. And if you look at it, you see it has a very narrow deck, very small deck. And that's because the tax was based on the area of the deck. You can also, it's not so clear, but you can imagine that at the waterline, the ship is actually quite round. It's quite broad where the water is on the ship. So it's thin at the top and then quite broad to the waterline. That turns out to be a very good way to build ships. And so it's seen as one of the reasons why the Dutch built such a strong seaborne empire, was because they had such good ships. And some people claim this is actually an example of a good tax avoidance scheme, because it led to this more effective shipping or ship design. The picture on the bottom, these are William and Edward Vestey, who were essentially ran a large multinational enterprise, starting really before the First World War. It was a meat packing business. They made a fortune. And so they were, for example, selling meat to the British Army during the First World War. And it was really very much a multinational effort. They were selling in France, they were raising cattle and so on in Argentina and Australia. They had enterprises elsewhere using refrigerated ships and so on and so forth. So you can see that they had all kinds of opportunities for all the tricks that today's multinationals get up to. So all the things that we describe when we think about the base erosion and profit shifting project, we think about transfer pricing issues, we think about the use of debt, we think about deferral, the ability to defer taxes, we think about inversion, companies may change their residence. The Vesti brothers were doing this 120 years ago. So for us, it's a nice way in the book to get into the intricacies of international taxation. And I don't know how well the phrase on the bottom left translates, but this was a quote from the Inland Revenue, the British tax, one of the officers who was trying to actually tax the Vestis, who tried to tax them like squeezing a rice pudding, because you just couldn't get a proper grip on the tax affairs of the Vestis. And of course, they actually formed a dynasty. So as we tell in the book, when in the 1970s, whenever it was, the Queen decided she was going to be income tax. So even the Queen was going to pay income tax. Lord Vesti at the time was reputed to have said, well, that means I'm the only one. That leaves me the only one basically not paying any tax. And then finally, we say quite a lot about tax administration through the ages. We talk about, the emergence of withholding, which goes back in England to Henry VIII's time in the 16th century. We talk about information exchange, so on. But just a few points here. One is that, as I mentioned, we see that the change in technology over the millennia has clearly been a big part of how taxation has changed, while the basic objectives not so much. So what's on the left? It's a very not digital thing. This is something from China from about 320 before Christ, before the Common Era. It's called a G, and you can see it's a beautiful object, and you can find it as a replica, at least in the Beijing Tax Museum. It turns out there are such things as tax museums around the world, but there's one in Beijing. So you can see this is beautiful bronze object, or bronze, even gold, I think. And you can see it's in two parts. What was this used for? This was used to enforce a tax exemption. That essentially ships traveling down one of the rivers in China claimed had a particular tax exemption to one particular prince, I think it was. And to implement this tax exemption, how it worked was there were two parts to this G. So one part was carried on the ship with the goods. The other part was held at the customs office. And the goods were allowed to pass tax-free only if these two bits could be fitted together. So it's pretty clever. And what's interesting, I think, one thing that strikes me is this looks very much like a bamboo stick, a bamboo tree. So it suggests to me that the Chinese were using this trick long before this. They would implement an exemption by splitting a bamboo, giving the two halves to different sides of the transactions. So it may not be digital, but it seems to me to have lots of similarities even with blockchain. We talk a bit about, we also talk quite a lot about tax administration, and the picture in the middle will probably be familiar to many of you. We talk about tax farming, the way in which really has been probably the dominant way of collecting taxes, probably through history, one could argue, at least taxes other than on goods, taxes that are related to transactions on goods, have often been farmed. Most famously, of course, in France with the tax farmers. We all know how that ended up. This is the end of the tax farmers, I think in 1793 or early 94 in France. So tax farming got a bad rap from the experience in France. Although it turned out that, as far as we can tell, when the books were finally settled between the tax farmers and the government, it turned out that far from the tax farmers having robbed the government, the tax farmers were actually owed money by the government. And the final picture on the right is another story that we very much like. This is the person on the statue is a gentleman called Robert Hart. So he was from Northern Ireland, and in the mid-19th century, he went out to China and rose to become head of the Chinese Imperial Customs Service, and became very widely respected for establishing it as really a world-class, at the time, customs organization. Very clean, thought of as a very uncorrupt organization, played an important role in modern China, efforts to modernize China at the time more generally, was highly honored by the Dowager Empress, Zhu Ji. She bestowed an honor on him so great, the honor even went back to his ancestors. So he was really, those of you who know how the IMF operates, Greg, and I'm sure others, Anne-Marie and others, he was kind of the archetypal long-term expert that we often, places like the IMF, we often put people in countries to help develop tax capacity in the long term, and he was the long-term expert par excellence, became a real devotee and really an inspiration. So he's the only tax administrator we know that actually had a statue built for him. It was taken down during the Second World War, but he's the only tax administrator, as I say, who has a statue, and also the only one, we should say, who actually has a novel written about him. Because as well as modernizing the customs service, he kept a series of diaries, and he had a very active and somewhat guilt-ridden love life. And these are reflected in now a novel called My Splendid Concubine. So he has, maybe we can all as tax administrators someday aspire to have statues raised to us and novels written about it. Might happen to Joel, but it certainly won't happen to me. But with that, Greg, thanks for your patience, and let me hand back to you and I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
Thanks. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for your presentation, which was very fast, very interesting. Please don't hesitate to ask questions in English or in French. I will forward them to Michael Keane. Joel.
Before we switch to the question session.
Oh, bonjour. Je ne parle pas du tout français.
Hello, I don't speak French at all.
Only, but no, I think we should jump right into the Q&A.
Ok. Alors, j'ai pas... Bon, moi, je vais commencer.
So I'll start. With everything that you worked on for this book, what would you think the priorities, what do you think the priorities are for countries, for developing countries that are being analyzed by economists working in developing countries when it comes to tax reform? What would be the most important lessons drawn from your book?
Okay, maybe I can start and see what Joe wants to. I think it's a hard question. We have we quote in the book a gentleman called Richard Good, who used to be in charge of fiscal affairs at the IMF, and he said something to the effect that all too often foreign experts go into countries and impose tax systems from their own countries. And he says, often with additional features that the expert has recommended for their own country, but didn't get adopted there. So I think there's a lesson, there's certainly a lesson there, I think, about modesty. And I think maybe I'll come back to that. But I suppose one of the things that strikes you when you write a book about taxation over thousands of years is just how slow it can be to build effective tax systems. Again, if you think about the country I know best, England or Britain, where by the early 19th century, I think a large part of why the Britain was so powerful was because we had developed a very good tax system, but we didn't develop it overnight. I mean, the start of the UK, the effective tax system in Britain, people argue, but exactly when the rise of this tax system began, but it's probably the 150 years before that, maybe the middle of the 17th century with the Civil War, or a bit later with the Glorious Revolution. It takes a lot of time to build tax systems, to build things like the parliamentary or the kind of accountability that's needed, to build strong civil services. And so I think even these days, when we think about working on taxation in developing countries, we tend to think, well, 5 years is a kind of medium term for thinking about tax reform. That's really a very short period of time in the scheme of things. So I think one lesson is we have to be maybe realistic in terms of what can be achieved in reasonable periods of time. And I think there is also, well, related to that too, of course, many of the events that led to strong tax systems were very unpleasant events. You know, you think two world wars are one of the reasons why we have such strong tax systems in many advanced economies, which is probably something not something we would recommend to others. But I think going back to Richard Good's argument, and I mean, you may have views on this too, Greg, but I think you could argue that we've made historic mistakes in some of the systems we've imposed on developing countries. That, for example, you take the corporate tax. You know, to many developing countries, have they really needed for the last, since independence, such complicated corporate tax systems, which are getting more complicated by the moment. Or we think about, the coming back to Cayo. I mean, did many Francophone African countries really need to try the old, before eventually giving it up, Le Projet Cayo? So I think maybe too late to go back, but you could say, for example, well, maybe we should have started in many low-income countries, not with the idea of an income tax as a mass tax, but as one that begins with the very wealthy and slowly gets extended, which is, again, how I think really what we'd see the development, certainly of the UK income tax, has been like that. It's start with a relatively narrow group and extend. So I'm not sure that helps us very much looking forward, but I think it may help us understand some of the mistakes we've made looking back. But Joel, do you want to add or correct?
Yeah, thanks. I feel I'm at a slight disadvantage because I don't understand the question. I have to, based on Mick's answer, I have to backwards induce what the question might have been. So Greg, can you give me a quick recitation of the question in English?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. Yeah, my question was very broad. It was what can we expect? What can we learn from your books about taxation in developing countries where the tax revenue to GDP ratio is pretty low?
Okay.
So,
all right. That is probably what I would have guessed the question is based on Mick's answer, and I'm going to leave that one to Mick. And so let's go on.
Thanks. Well, that's good. If you can infer the question from my answer, that must have been a good answer, right? But anyway, carry on. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Sure. No, it's. No, I like historical mistakes. I think it's a very good idea. And since you are speaking about CIT, what do you think? I'm surprised that in your books and given your previous works, you don't mention so much tax competition or tax interactions among countries or tariff wars and so on. What do you think about this minimum tax pushed by the Biden administration at the OECD level? And do we have in your books some historical example of this kind of coordination or competition?
We have more examples of people and companies taking advantage of the lack of harmonization among countries to benefit themselves. We tell the story of the Vesti brothers in the late 19th century. These are two brothers in Britain who had a global meat production and distribution business. And a lot of their tax avoidance and maybe evasion behavior foreshadows what happens now and what happened later when countries do not coordinate, when there is not a minimum income tax. They moved their operations to Argentina. They incorporated a business in Argentina, as Mick mentioned. And so we do actually spend a lot of time on the technical details of how to tax multinational companies. But those issues are not as easily shown in an image like the building with the boarded up windows, but we try. The best we do is a picture of the building in the Cayman Islands, a noted tax haven, that, gee, I forget the number, but apparently at the time of the picture, there were 20,000 businesses located there. And when that was brought to light, others pointed out that there was a building in Delaware, the state in the United States, where it's particularly tax attractive to incorporate. A rather medium-sized or even small building in Delaware that apparently houses 10,000 or more corporations.
Je voudrais juste, je vous coupe juste un instant.
Take the floor for a second.
Je voudrais juste préciser que vous avez accès à la traduction en bas de l'écran. C'est valable pour les speakers, mais aussi pour les personnes qui vous suivent.
And attendees,
so,
you can
Joel,
have access to interpretation at the bottom of the screen.
To the translation at the bottom of the screen, if you want. If you have some French question, you can have them in English.
Yeah. Thanks, Fabienne. I was just going to mention, following on Joel, we do have a chapter on international. We do talk a bit about the minimum taxation, but things have been moving pretty quickly just since we finished the book. And it actually relates to some work beyond the book. Certainly doing some work on that and figuring out, well, what would an optimal minimum rate be? But maybe just on Joel's point, maybe I can quickly just share one picture from the book. I don't know if you can see that. So this is where we try to, on the left is the a tax avoidance scheme. Many of you will know this is the double Irish Dutch sandwich scheme on the left. And to illustrate how weird this is, we have a picture on the right, which is by a British illustrator whose name, for the moment, I forget. Joel probably remember, who was famous for drawing pictures of weird machines. So this is a weird machine on the right, which was for making double Gloucester cheese by the Gruyere method. So we don't go into all the details of how the scheme on the left worked, but as Joel says, we can use the Vestes to illustrate some of them, but then also put them together in this kind of overall mess that we see on the right. But and one of the things that there were various things that didn't make it to the book in the end. But for example, we do have looked quite a lot at tax competition in relation to shipping. I mentioned shipping before in a different context, but I think shipping is a very interesting example of how tax competition really can lead to very low tax rates. But historically, there aren't that many examples we can point to. I think, as you say, there's a couple in CMAC and WAMO, I guess, have minimum corporate rates. But beyond that, not much we say about that.
Thank you. Donc nous avons une question d'Ousmane.
We have a question from Ousmane. He's asking if historically taxes are at the origin of instability and wars between states.
The origin of instability and even wars. So between states, I guess your example of Bolivia is very excellent for this, no? But maybe...
I think Bolivia is probably our clearest example. The other, another story, people often think that what the British call the American War of Independence was about a tax increase that the British imposed on tea into the colonies. We tell that story, that turns out to be simply wrong. That in fact what the British had done was cut the tax on tea. Just to say a bit more about that, essentially the British, we had a tax on tea that was levied in the American colonies when it arrived. Wasn't very popular, but the British wanted to keep that tax on tea fixed, as a matter of principle. But the British also had a problem with the East India Company, had huge amounts of unsold tea. So we really wanted to sell tea in the Americas. So the clever idea was, and this will appeal to the customs experts here, the British realized that the tea, before it went to the Americas, paid customs duty when it entered England, before it went to England. So basically what the British did was remove the customs duty in London. We basically gave full drawback, actually cut the price of tea. Smart idea, went completely wrong because that meant we undercut the smugglers in Boston and elsewhere, who are very powerful people. So we can't say, in some sense, if you want to say that the American War of Independence was triggered by tax, well, it was triggered by a tax cut, not by a tax increase. I think there aren't that many, Joe will correct me, other examples where we think tax in the similar way to Bolivia was a cause of war, but clearly taxes help determine who wins the wars. And, you know, I think we know, or it's pretty clear, for example, that the Britain's dominance was largely due to effective revenue raising. French Revolution obviously was a kind of basically a fiscal failure. But I don't know, Joel, are there other stories we have on the tax?
I don't know of any. By the way, thank you for pointing out that the translation works in both directions. So I now can understand both French and English, at least somewhat. Yeah, I don't know of any other wars that we can directly ascribe to taxation, but the interaction between war and tax is clear in both directions. For example, I think a strong argument can be made that the progressivity of income tax in the UK and the US and perhaps elsewhere is due in part to the losses, the human losses in wars, after which the people who bore the brunt of those losses, the soldiers, the lower and middle class people, said, hey, we have sacrificed a lot. It's now time for corporations and richer people to sacrifice. And you can really see the large increase in the progressivity of tax systems, especially after World War II, but in the US after World War I. So that's a connection that runs in the other direction. It's also true that a lot of innovations in tax collection happened because in war countries needed revenue and they needed it fast. Withholding of tax by employers was introduced in the UK and the US during World War II. And in the US, the income tax changed from what was called a class tax to a mass tax during World War II. Before World War II, the exemption level of income was high enough that only a fairly small fraction of people were subject to income tax. Not true after World War II. So the connections between war and tax are very close and they run in both directions.
Thank you very much. I have a question because I read some part of the books, not all the books. I didn't have time for the moment, but étant donné la crise COVID-19.
Well, given the current COVID crisis, and since you've been working on taxation of war providers, people who benefited from wars, so who do you think will benefit from the crisis, and what are the taxes that will occur in countries that paid a lot to support the damaged economic activity because of the shocks and successive lockdowns?
You want to go first, Joel, or do you want me?
Yeah, I'll take that one quickly. Yeah, I think it's a great question to raise the analogy between the COVID pandemic and war. It's really a fascinating analogy to consider. It is true that in the US now, we are seriously considering very progressive tax increases. The Biden administration has said it wants to raise a lot more revenue, but it wants to raise it by taxing corporations and only people whose income is over $400,000. So that, if that happens, and the political chances are not clear, but if that happens, it seems to fit the story that people view this crisis as one whose burden was borne largely by the mass of the population, and some corporations ended up doing very well. And so it fits the picture that the US and other countries are considering increasing the progressivity of the tax, and some countries are talking about instituting excess profits taxes, which were quite common during and immediately after World War I and World War II. There's one other interesting tax angle of COVID, I think, which is, transmission of COVID is clearly a negative externality. And in the book, we talk about taxes that are instituted not really to raise revenue, but to alter behavior, to reduce negative externalities, activities with negative externalities, and increase activities with positive externalities. But we note that tax is not always the best policy instrument to deal with that. And I think COVID is a good example of that. Most countries have had lockdown orders and mask orders. That's a way to deal with the negative externality in a regulatory, not a tax way. There have been fines instituted for people who violate those rules, but I don't know of any countries that have tried to have a Pigouvian tax on behavior which has negative externalities related to COVID transmission.
Yeah, maybe just to pick up a bit on the excess profit taxes, as Joel says, it's an idea that people have begun to or have been talking about in the current context, and indeed that's a tax that has very clear antecedents of, in the past, because in both the First World War and the Second World War, many countries, in fact, I think all the main powers at war had excess profit taxes of various kinds, and they were big money raisers. I think the UK during the First World War was raising about a quarter of all its revenue from an excess profit tax, something like that in the US. I don't know about France, but I do know, for example, in 1939, even before the outbreak of war, I think England, I think France and Germany introduced excess profit taxes. It's almost like part of rearmament with the war coming was to introduce the excess profit taxes. And they took different forms, but they were in the end, the ones that worked well were really very much like allowance for corporate equity schemes. That is, you had some allowed rate of return, and then you paid tax on the excess, sometimes at progressive rates. So I think there's a link there, not only with the pandemic, but also with the current debate on reforming corporate tax. I think there are some lessons there from the past. Also, too, although we don't talk about it in the book, I think there are cases where countries have introduced what one might call solidarity taxes, solidarity surcharges often, to pay for national emergencies. So the Germans had a solidarity surcharge to deal with reunification. Japan and Australia have had them to deal with natural disasters, often in the form of just an add-on to an existing tax, income tax or the corporate tax. So as Joel says, I think there is a question you raise is a really interesting one of whether we're going to see some kind of sense of solidarity leading to taxes of that kind. Maybe it's too late. Maybe the moment has passed for those kind of measures. But it's a great question, as you say.
Thank you. Merci. Vous pouvez aussi prendre la parole, me dit Fabienne.
Fabienne is telling me that you, dear participants, can also take the floor and ask questions directly to our speakers.
J'ai une question d'ailleurs de
I have a question,
Monsieur Mahaman Eladji Ousmane.
A question from
qui veut prendre la parole.
Mahaman Eladji
lui donner la parole?
Would like to take the floor. Can I give him the floor? Sure.
Monsieur Eladji Ousmane, vous êtes avec nous?
Mr. Eladji Ousmane, are you with us? I think he's muted. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Grégoire, can you hear me well? Yes. We can hear you. It's fine. We hear you okay.
Ah, c'est a priori un peu compliqué. Je sais pas si...
I think it's a bit complicated.
Nous, on vous entend très très bien.
We hear you very well. I unmuted myself, but I can't hear you. Could you please raise your hand, Grégoire, if you hear me well? Yes. It's okay. You can go ahead.
Bon, je crois qu'on l'a perdu.
I think we lost him, says Fabienne. Okay, so there was another question.
The world tax system. C'est une question de Abou Bakari. Une question très générale. Comment stabiliser?
So that's a very broad question. How can we stabilize and improve the global tax system?
You want to go?
I leave very broad questions to my co-author.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess one thinks first of all about current developments on the international corporate tax side of things. And I think all I'd say there is that, for example, in the book, we talk about the principle, the kind of century-old norms of taxation, you know, the physical presence test for the taxation of multinationals, issues of profit shifting, arm's length pricing, and I think we're probably, like many, quite rather suspect that many of those features have outlived their time. And so I think when you look at the recent international corporate tax developments, I think you'd have to say, well, for example, what's called Pillar 1 of the OECD proposals that give some right to taxing rights to market countries, to destination countries, which include some element of taxation by formula, stepping back from arm's length pricing. I think you'd have to say those are really pretty remarkable developments, really recognizing that these century-old norms have probably outlived their usefulness. Now, you can certainly argue that what's being proposed is limited in these respects and is very complicated. Whether it will stabilize things in the short run, who knows? But I think you could certainly say that those developments really hold out some hope that we are going to end up with a more stable, because a more coherent international tax system. And I think you could say the same about the minimum tax proposal. So I don't know if that's too narrow an answer, but I think one can see some, for people as old as me who've been looking at international corporate tax for I don't know how long, it's kind of really just amazing how far we've moved the last two or 3 years. It's just kind of just amazing. And I think ultimately we have to say it's really a very positive development. I don't have much thoughts on the wider tax system, but I did notice there was a question about whether the book has been translated into French. Sadly, not yet, but we're very happy to have volunteers to do that. But it would be great to have it translated. But yeah, I think that's all I can offer on that one, I'm afraid. And I guess war, we've more or less covered, I think, most of our thoughts. Unless Joel has other ones, I think we've covered most of the thoughts we've had on war and conflict. I'm sure there's much more to be said because war is, you know, the links between war and taxation are just so close, sometimes closer than we want to recognize. But yeah, I think we've probably said what we have to say on war. In a way, it's quite remarkable that the VAT is kind of didn't have anything to do with war, which is, I'm sure there must be war somewhere in the history of the VAT, but it's kind of surprising that the history of the VAT is, as far as we can see, has nothing to do with war. Yeah. Thanks.
Merci. Moi, je pense qu'au CRD, on pourra désigner certains volontaires.
I think that we might ask some people, some volunteers to translate the book into French. We could do that within 30 maybe.
Wonderful.
Comme on parle, since we are speaking about CIT, do you have examples of tax incidents? I mean, okay, taxing profits at the end, you don't reach the right.
Yeah.
So I'm sure and I know that your book is full of very good example of tax incidents. Donc, l'incident fiscal.
Yeah, we have some some interesting historical episodes where the ultimate burden of taxes, its incidence, don't end up where it was expected or even intended. A modern example in the US is just going back a few decades. There was a tax put on yachts. And the idea was this was a way to increase the progressivity of the overall tax system, with the understandable background that most people who buy yachts are very wealthy. That is certainly true. But although I don't think there's been a very careful study of this, it certainly turned out that some of the burden was borne not by people who would want to buy yachts, but by the people who make yachts. And those are decidedly, on average, not very wealthy people. So some of the burden went from the consumer to part of the supply chain. An example farther back in history was the English, who I think we've proven is the country that has the most interesting and unusual taxes, that, at least that we know of. There was a tax on personal servants. And the idea, I think, again, was to increase the progressivity of the tax. People who were wealthy enough to be able to hire personal servants would bear the burden. But it turns out, again, without a comprehensive study of incidents, it turns out some of the burden was borne by the people, in particular women, who would be personal servants, who were in that business, but because of the tax imposed, were not employed or employable. So we think incidence of taxes does not enter into the public debate as much as it often should. The financial transactions tax is being proposed as an example of that. And we try with vivid examples to show that the incidence is not what the name of the tax suggests, and it is often not what the supporters of the tax intend.
Yeah, can I just add, I'm really glad you asked that question, Greg, because I think I said at the outset that one of the things we're trying to do is to convey these ideas that are familiar to economists to a wider public. And I think incidence is one of the hardest to convey, partly because I think, as Joel's kind of hinting, people label taxes in ways that try to prejudge what the incidence is. So you call the financial transactions tax the Robin Hood tax, which is kind of prejudging where you think the incidence would be. And I think we want to say that, well, it's not always easy to tell where the incidence is, but we really need to kind of at least think about it and not be misled by names. But maybe if I can just briefly to add my own sort of favorite story on incidence, which is, again, the English back in, I think, the 12th century, something like that, discovered that we could have a nice tax on wool, exports of wool. It became a real source of money for the monarch. And the tax was sort of negotiated with the merchants who dealt in the wool, who were basically usually Italian merchants. But of course, the wool owners of England realized that, well, when the tax went up, the merchants simply paid them less for the wool that the manors and the monasteries were selling to the Italian merchants. So, seeing that the real incidence was on them, the wool growers really put the monarch under a lot of pressure to say, well, look, you shouldn't be negotiating this tax with the Italians, because although they're the ones who kind of hand over the money, we're the ones who bear the real burden. And this became a long-running issue between the Crown and the Commons, and was reportedly one of the reasons for the kind of rise of Parliament, was to say, well, this is where we have to discuss these things, because we're the ones who bear the incidence of the tax. So yeah, thanks again for raising that one, because I think that's where I think we can really do a much better job of insisting to people that they at least think through what the incidence would be and explain what their reasons for any views they may take on where the incidence of a tax will ultimately lie.
Merci, oui. L'incidence fiscale. La taxe sur les yachts a été...
Thank you very much. The tax on yachts, well, there was a new version of it that was introduced in France recently, actually. Just to echo what Joel said. The Macron government modified the wealth tax and reintroduced a tax on yachts a couple of years ago. And in the end, there are only 3 yachts in France. All the other yachts went to other countries. Now we have a question from Mr. Ronder and Everson. What do you think of
so free trade areas in Africa? Donc les zones franches, les exonérations fiscales, les
so free trade areas, tax exemptions, etc.
We don't explicitly talk about free trade areas. As I say, we don't talk all that much about current customs issues. I think on exemptions, we certainly, I think, tell many stories to illustrate the dangers of tax exemptions, which we're all, I think, familiar with these days in terms of, essentially having little positive effect for loss of revenue. We have several. So our favorite story on that. It doesn't have directly address the free trade zones in Africa, but just to share one of our nice stories about exemptions and how even well-intentioned exemptions can have undesired side effects. So this was in Argentina, had a tax on bachelors. And many countries over the years have had taxes on bachelors to kind of, I guess, to either because they think bachelors don't have family responsibilities, and we are talking about bachelors, I think here, didn't have family responsibilities, so they should pay more, or to encourage bachelors to marry. So Argentina had a tax of this kind, but then they realized, well, what do you do if a man, and we are talking about men here, proposed to a woman and she turned him down? It really seems quite hard to tax somebody for being a bachelor when they really didn't want to be a bachelor. So some kind-hearted officials decided to give an exemption for men who could prove that they had offered marriage to a woman and she had turned them down. So, what emerged, as tax people won't be surprised to learn, what emerged was a group of women known as, I think, professional marriage refusers. Professional lady rejectors. So for a small fee, they would sign a piece of paper saying that you had asked them to marry you, but they had turned you down. Now, actually, that's not a bad, that probably does summarize pretty well my, at least, attitude towards many tax exemptions that, on the face of it, they can sometimes sound quite persuasive, but not only do they lose you revenue, but they lead to these sort of sometimes rather ridiculous and unanticipated harmful consequences. But
well, my favorite story about exemptions turns out not to be true, probably, but it's such a good story. Give me 60 seconds, and this is about the English tax on dogs, which was put into place because the royals didn't want peasants' dogs to interfere with their hunting. So there was a tax on dogs, but there was an exemption for dogs without tails on the idea that dogs without tails were useless for hunting. Well, by now, maybe you can see where this is going. The story goes that many peasants just cut off the tails of their dogs to save on tax. And the story continues that some people got so used to seeing certain dogs without tails that to this day, these dogs are curtailed, even though the tax is long gone. That's my favorite story, but it turns out it's probably not true. So it's such a good story. We tell it in the book, but then warn our readers that it's probably not true, although it's everywhere on the internet. But people tell me I shouldn't believe everything on the internet.
That's true. Anne-Marie Jourjean, one of my colleagues, we spoke about this yesterday, about this dog tax, and she had a different version of it. Dogs without tails were working dogs, and that's why they were exonerated, whereas dogs with tails were luxury dogs.
Wow, that's it. pretty much the opposite of the story I read.
The idea was to cut the tails of your dog in order to avoid to pay tax, because then your dog becomes a working dog.
Okay. So the behavioral response is the same, but the intention behind the tax is different in that story.
I'm just thinking we had another, there's a dog's tax story that we looked at that didn't make it into the book, which was actually about the First World War. Do you remember that one, Joel? I think it was in the parts of occupied France that the Germans imposed a tax on, because dogs were actually quite important, right? I think in the First World War. But it became effectively an act of resistance to basically kill all your dogs, I think was one of the behavioral responses. So we didn't put that one in the book because the story of massacring dogs we thought would not be a great seller for the book.
Merci.
Thank you. Speaking about exemptions, do you have examples or stories or lessons to be learned from a dynamic approach to tax? For example, when it comes to tax amnesty?
Because sometimes maybe the thinking are too static, too much static.
We don't talk about, I don't think we talk about tax amnesties. We talk about, we talk a fair bit about reasons why people do and do not comply with taxes, where clearly we talk quite a lot about, you know, perceptions of likelihood of being punishment or excuse. And we talk a fair bit about some of the schemes these days for exchange of information. They're not so much about the voluntary. We don't really get into the voluntary disclosure schemes that sometimes go with those, which are a little bit like amnesty. But I don't know if anything comes to Joel's mind on that.
Yeah, by now I don't remember 100% what made it into the book and what made it onto the cutting floor. Even though our book is fairly long, the first draft was about a third longer than it is now. And so some stories actually didn't make it into the final version. We are certainly aware of the fact that in understanding the impact of certain taxes, one has to be very careful to distinguish the short-term response from the long-term response. And this is an issue right now in the United States, because the Biden administration has proposed a very large increase in the taxation of capital gains. And if you want to understand what the likely behavioral response to that is, one has to be really careful to distinguish the timing effects from the longer term effects. For example, if it were known that the capital gains tax were going to go up as of January 1st, 2022, you can be sure that there would be lots of sales of assets with capital gains in late 2021, certainly more than you would think. And so that's a timing change. These are sales that probably would have been made later, but they're brought up to 2021 to avoid the higher tax. So just as a technical issue, if you want to understand a likely behavioral response, you need to differentiate the timing response from the long-term response.
We do talk, sorry, Greg, remember we do talk, have a few pages on what we would all call the time consistency issue.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this.
Which we don't launch in by calling it that, but we talk about that not in the amnesty context, but in the context of this idea of capital levies, which again is sort of fairly topical. That, well, you know, why didn't we, after the First World War, as lots of countries talked about, why not have a one-off capital levy? And so there, you know, the issues of time consistency come up. That, well, you know, if you do it today, what's to stop people thinking you'll do it again in the future? And I think we also mention amnesties in that context, saying, well, okay, if, you know, there's this whole credibility issue that if you give an amnesty today, I don't think we give historical episodes of amnesties, but I think we do give the story in the context of the capital levy debate.
Merci. Oui, c'était plus dans cette approche cohérence temporelle des décisions et des politiques.
Temporal coherence and tax policies.
Oui, exactement.
So the question, why is taxation in developing countries, which are in permanent conflict, why are they less important? I think we already have the answer within the question.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the interesting thing may be to sort of turn that around and think, well, what are the, and you would all have better sense of the answer than me. What are the best ways to raise revenue if you want to basically in fragile states? There are different types of fragility, but what are the best ways of raising revenue? And I guess, as I say, that may be something that people at 30 can advise us on. But it used to be, for example, that we would look first to customs and say customs is the easiest way to raise revenue. May not be the case in countries where they don't really control their borders. Nowadays, I guess we talk more about raising revenue from mobile phones or telephony and all these kind of things. But I don't have great insights on the kind of the follow-up to that question of what's the best way of actually building capacity and raising revenue in these countries.
Fabienne, est-ce qu'il y a des interventions?
Fabienne, are there any people who want to take the floor?
No.
Questions? No.
Yeah, please.
There was a question, I'm not quite sure I translated right, about the images we use in the books.
I didn't pick up this, but
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I understood the question, but to say we certainly, we're very keen on pictures, because as you'll gather, we think that pictures actually tell a lot of the stories in ways that are more accessible to people than supply and demand diagrams of yeah, we try and make good use of the images. I should say too, we're always, if people have stories, we've made a note, for example, of your Macron's yacht tax. We're very much in the market for stories. Maybe for a second edition, though I don't expect to live that long. But also, Joel and I are kind of putting together a website, which we'll send details later, where we want people to kind of provide more weird stories. But yeah, no, there are a couple of pictures we wanted to use but weren't able to for copyright. But yeah, I think we try to work quite hard on the pictures. It's not quite a picture book, but certainly I know my brother said he wouldn't read it unless there were pictures in it, so we had to put pictures in it for my brother.
I think we have the record for most pictures in any tax book. The last time I counted, we had about 70, and it is because I think sometimes the pictures more vividly convey the issue than, as the saying goes, than 1,000 words. And when we were writing the book, we always had in the back of our mind how difficult it is to teach a class in taxation in a way that's engaging. So we hope those of you in the audience who are teachers will see if you can use the book as a supplement to whatever textbook you're using. And we think it will keep your students more engaged. We hope so, at least.
Ouais, définitivement. Il y a beaucoup d'exemples.
Yes, of course, there's many examples and images that will attract the attention of students and also of decision makers too, not only students. And there's very important tax issues. And this will definitely be very useful. Are there any other questions? Of course, I have a privileged conversation with our dear authors.
On a une question de Faisal Sawadogo.
Faisal Sawadogo. Faisal, yes?
Je lui donne la parole.
I'll give him the floor.
Faisal, est-ce que c'est bon pour toi?
C'est bon, est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Yes, can you
Très
hear
bien.
me? Yes, very well.
Ouais. Donc, avant tout, je voudrais remercier Michael et Joël justement de nous faire cet honneur de par leur présence.
Honoring us
Donc,
with their
c'est
presence.
deux grandes figures justement
These
de la fiscalité. Hein.
Great
On lit beaucoup vos papiers et vos écrits, donc vous avoir en direct en un seul coup, je dirais que c'est tout un honneur pour nous. Et donc, j'ai beaucoup lu avec attention votre livre. Donc, dès l'annonce déjà, j'ai vu que c'était un livre assez intéressant qui traitait de toute l'histoire de la fiscalité. Et comme vous pouvez voir, je ne l'ai pas encore terminé, mais ça ne va pas tarder. Donc, de ce que je retiens déjà de ma première lecture de ce livre, c'est est-ce qu'on peut retenir ici que la taxation est en grande partie est-ce que la taxation, on peut dire que la taxation explique une grande partie de l'histoire du monde? En lisant votre livre, c'est la première question que j'ai. Donc, je pense particulièrement à la Bolivie ou encore à la guerre mondiale, comme vous l'avez si bien expliqué. Hein. Et donc, ça, c'était ma première question. Et ma deuxième question, c'est est-ce que finalement, la taxation n'est pas aussi quelque part à l'origine du creusement des inégalités qu'on observe aujourd'hui de par le monde, hein, pour parler justement de la progressivité de l'impôt. Donc aussi bien l'impôt sur le revenu des personnes que l'impôt sur le revenu des sociétés. Donc pour prendre des exemples justement en rapport avec le livre, je vais parler justement pour ce qui concerne de l'impôt sur les revenus des personnes. Je pense particulièrement à la section sur le taxing femininity ou encore la taxe sur le passage avec les chaussures sur les ponts en Sierra Leone. Ou même la taxe sur les fenêtres, justement. Et pour ce qui concerne la taxation, justement, ou la progressivité en matière d'impôt sur les sociétés, je pense particulièrement à la taxe, par exemple, qu'il y a eu sur les bateaux néerlandais avec les BAFAN, tout ça, etc. Ou même encore la partie taxing knowledge qui, à la fin, suscite quand même beaucoup de réflexions sur les inégalités qu'il y a eu justement entre les riches et les pauvres. Donc ça, c'est la deuxième question que j'ai à vous poser pour ma lecture de ce livre. Et dernièrement, je voudrais vous poser une question donc, pour avoir votre avis personnel. Hein. Est-ce que vous pensez que de telles folies fiscales pourraient avoir sens de nos jours? Donc certaines histoires justement que vous racontez si bien clairement, aussi bien avec les illustrations en images que les écrits même pourraient avoir du sens de nos jours. Donc voilà, je vous remercie encore une fois de plus pour votre présentation.
Let me try to say a few words about the first question. Thank you for those questions, by the way. Very, very important and deep questions. I'll try to scratch the surface of at least the first one, which was about, do we think that tax plays a central role in history? And I think the answer is got to be yes. We spent 7 years or so of our life putting this book together. So yes, we think it's important. I think it's true that the governments or the state plays a central role in history, and taxation is about the relationship between the state and the population. And so because of that, I think the answer has to be yes. In the beginning of the book, we talk about the historical development of that relationship between government and the population. There is a long era where the citizenry don't have to approve through voting, for example, of the tax system. And then we have a second era where they now do. And so that relationship changes in important ways over the course of history. But I think it is always an important or the key fact of the relationship between the individual and the state. So it certainly plays a central role in history.
No, I think I was just going to say again, I think that they're sort of great profound questions. I guess as tax people, we have to make sure we don't think tax explains kind of everything. So there are people who think that President Kennedy was assassinated because he was going to roll back a tax break for oil and gas. We don't, I think, subscribe to that one. But nonetheless, I think we probably think tax accounts for more than people often give it credit for. I think over the years, Joel and I, every time we read a book, we sort of look for tax in the index. What do they say about tax? And it's kind of surprising how many don't. I don't know, you read a history of the Russian Empire or something, and you know, tax is a footnote on page 312. It's kind of, that can't be right. I think that's certainly a large part of the motivation for writing the book, was that tax is matters much more than people give it credit for, and that, you know, we like people to help people to understand and think about tax a bit more. We also describe there's a quote from a book about what's it called, the Pale King, I think. Pale King, which is supposed to be the best book on literary work on tax, but it was written by an author about his time working in an IRS office, and he has a line about to the effect that the secret of tax policy is it's boring. It's really super boring. And why it's so boring is because then governments can do whatever the hell they want, because no one takes any interest. And I think that's part of what we want to do in the book, is say, well, tax is not only important, but it's also kind of interesting.
Thank you. Et pour ce qui concerne maintenant les inégalités.
And regarding inequalities?
To be honest, I don't think I have anything terribly profound there to share. I mean, I think the interesting question is sort of the one that I think Joel raised, which is, well, you know, for example, we hear a lot of talk these days about how inequality and how we need to address it through the tax system. I think it's not clear historically that there's been inequality per se that has given rise to the most progressive tax system. As Joel says, it's been, you know, there's a plausible argument that it's often been to do with this compensatory feature that we get through wars, which we don't get from inequality per se. It's complicated by COVID in ways we discussed, but I think the links between inequality and the use of the tax system in response are maybe a bit more complicated than we've often thought. And I seem to remember that there's some empirical work, maybe out of date, that suggests that it wasn't actually the most inegalitarian societies that had the most redistributed tax and spending systems. But again, Joel, do you want to?
Yeah, the question raises the importance of distinguishing between what we think of as tax policies and other policies. So let's consider inequality. I think tax policy is the natural policy to consider if you want to reduce the wealth or income of the very richest. That's what we're about to take seriously here in the US, increasing significantly the progressivity of the income tax. But of course, another way to reduce inequality is to provide more resources to the poorest members of society, and their tax, what we call tax, is only one of many instruments and may not even be the best. So in the US now, our biggest anti-poverty program is run through the tax system, the earned income tax credit. But I imagine that potentially even more successful programs that increase the well-being of the poorest in this society are not going to be delivered through the tax system, but through improved healthcare, improved education, improved environment. There, the tax system plays an intermediate role, because you might have to raise the resources, the taxes from high-income people in order to fund those programs which are crucial to raising the well-being of the poor.
Merci beaucoup.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much.
Merci Faisal.
Thank you, Faisal, for your questions. I understood that there was also a question on taxing knowledge, right? Yes. Tax on robots.
Oh, taxing knowledge and robots. Okay, that's a great pairing. I'll take the first. I think it was 19th century United Kingdom. There were taxes on newspapers and on newsprint, and apparently they came into being because the government was unhappy with news stories that and just news criticizing the government, and the people who opposed such a tax dubbed it the tax on knowledge, and that just brings up what we talk about in the book, that there's been very creative labeling of tax in order to encourage support, or more likely encourage opposition. And the tax on knowledge is an example. A more modern example in the US is the successful effort of Republicans to refer to what in the US is the estate and gift tax. We call that the death tax. And for obvious reasons, that makes the tax sound even worse. The tax on knowledge didn't last, and most countries now go out of their way to avoid taxes that look like a tax on knowledge, but some countries suppress the diffusion of knowledge in non-tax ways, for sure.
Thank you.
Robots. Mick, you got something on robots?
Oh, robots. We talk a little bit about that, and I guess we talk a little bit about we talk about taxation of rents in that context. I think one of the ideas we try to get through in the book related to what we talk about on incidence ideas, and also kind of trying to convey some optimal tax ideas. We do talk quite a lot about taxing rents, and I think rents would come up obviously in relation to robots as probably a first point of call. But I suppose we talk more when we look forward. In the last chapter of the book, we look forward to what might be the big changes in tax systems. I don't think we particularly see robots as, in that sense, a more fundamental shift. We talk about where the corporate tax might go, which relates to the taxation of rents, but we talk about things like we think tax filing, which of course is the big very big in the US, many other countries, is probably going the way, I think, of the rotary clock or rotary phone or whatever. We talk about, maybe relating to some of the questions that came up, we talk about how maybe in the future we might escape this kind of tyranny of taxing over the year. And you can see why in agricultural societies you might want to levy tax over a kind of however long it takes the Earth to go around the sun. It's not at all clear why you want to do that. In many modern societies, maybe we'll move towards more lifetime basis of taxation. Maybe at the same time, coming back to one of Joel's points, we might see more integration of tax with spending. I think increasingly we already see tax administrations getting involved on the spending side through earned income tax credits and so on and so forth. So we might see tax systems that are capable of taking both this kind of longer term vision of well-being, but also responding to very short-term needs that people have on the spending side. So we do talk, when we look forward, I think those are some of the things we talk about a little bit more. We talk about maybe more fundamentally this idea that, income tax is in some sense a core tax we use these days, because income happens to be the best proxy we have these days to how well off somebody is. In the old days, we had other proxies. We had number of windows or social class. So there are these issues looking forward, as we learn more about human genome, about how, for example, we might constrain ourselves not to relate tax systems to inherent physical characteristics of people. So we say a little bit about robots, but probably we see more profound challenges, I would say, other aspects of the system.
Merci. Une dernière question.
Thank you very much. One last question. We have many PhD students listening. So,
great.
Last question from Tarna Siloui. Echoing your story about the bridge in Curacao, so what are the links between the story and the work by Tyler or the book entitled Nudge, Libertarian Paternalism, Behavioral Economics?
Chapters of your book, we have this impression of that you are already, by telling us some stories about tax, you are already in behavioral economics, speaking implicitly about nudge and so on. But maybe it's I'm biased because I was reading, and Tarna too is reading this book also, this very also important book from Tyler, from the last very recent Nobel Prize.
Yeah. That's a good point. Joel, would you want to take that one?
Yeah, well, a lot of the book is about what we used to call behavioral response to taxation, real responses such as labor supply, but also avoidance and evasion responses. These days, when we use the word behavioral, people tend to think of behavioral economics. As all the PhD students in the audience know, which means that we need to go beyond the rational model of decision-making and accept that some people are subject to behavioral anomalies. They might be misperceive the tax system. They might have built-in biases. So we talk about that in the book through examples such as taxes on cigarettes and on smoking. What is the justification for that? It's probably not a standard externality argument, but it could very well be an internality argument that many smokers are myopic. They don't take into account the long-term effects on their own health. The people don't save enough for the same reason that they're myopic. So I think anybody knows that some people are like that. Some people are subject to these kinds of biases and are myopic. To me, the open question is whether how substantial a change in tax policy that this suggests. In the US, I think many of the policies that you might think of to deal with these kinds of issues would be opposed by many people on the grounds that it's an intrusion on their right to make their own decisions and an intrusion on their privacy.
And I like the idea that our book itself is an exercise in this kind of behavioral economics. That's yeah, it's interesting. We certainly say, we certainly think the issues of naming, we think are, are kind of important, how to salience and how people perceive things. And I think when I guess we also think that, tax administrators have been doing behavioral economics for hundreds of years, right? I mean, the way they feed on aspects of things that make taxpayers comply. I think they would claim they've been doing this since time immemorial. They haven't just been using kind of penalties of various kinds. They have been sometimes quite innovative in how they exploit people's foibles to get them to pay more tax. Yeah.
Merci, thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. There are so many anecdotes, and that could lead to a lot of interesting research for our PhD students listening today. Thank you so much. If there are no other questions, I think that we are going to leave it there. Thank you again for this brilliant presentation of an excellent book. We recommend it, of course. There's a discount, 30% discount that we posted on the chat. So you can take advantage of that. Princeton University Press. Thank you, Mick and Joel, for taking part in our webinar.
Thank you.
And see you soon.
Thanks very much. Great. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.